Constitutional interpretation, citizenship, and legal evolution. 1. Introduction. You are entering a discourse that highlights the complexity of constitutional interpretation, citizenship, and the evolution of law in the United States. This discussion begins by situating the conversation within a modern context of podcasts and independent education, but it immediately turns to deeper legal and historical principles. The foundation of the analysis rests on the distinction between people and persons as found in the Constitution. From this distinction, you learn that the debates surrounding law and citizenship are not merely theoretical, they shape the legal reality of millions. At the heart of this exploration is the effort to condense decades of research into a form accessible to you today. The claim is that thousands of hours of study and nearly a lifetime of legal findings can be transmitted in weeks if you follow structured treatises and readings. This raises the critical issue of efficiency. How can a legal education, once requiring generations of accumulated knowledge, now be compressed into concentrated frameworks that accelerate your understanding? The answer lies in clear definitions and systematic study. If you read a treatise on the word person, study the debates on driving versus traveling, and follow guided coursework, you will stand on equal ground with individuals who have studied for 30 years or more. This reaffirms that law, while often hidden behind jargon, becomes accessible when it is broken into logical, precise, and historically anchored components. Footnote. This section establishes the importance of structured learning and introduces the distinction between people and persons as the gateway to the deeper analysis. 2. The importance of foundational texts. You are confronted with the challenge of building a clear understanding of law by starting with the text that first shaped its meaning. Central to this approach is the Constitution itself, which deliberately separates the words people and persons. This difference is not accidental, it becomes the foundation for centuries of legal interpretation, court rulings, and practical applications of citizenship. The task before you is not only to read these words but also to trace their consequences. For example, when you study the preamble, you notice that it begins with "we the people," establishing the concept of sovereignty. Yet, when you move into Article 1, Section 9, you discover the slave importation clause where the word persons first appears in distinction from people. From this moment, the legal system of the United States creates separate categories of recognition that will later define rights, obligations, and citizenship. You must understand that this deliberate separation gave rise to decades of court cases wrestling with who qualifies as people and who is confined to persons. As you trace this line of interpretation forward, you encounter critical moments such as the Dred Scott decision and the Reconstruction Amendments. Each time the law references persons, it carries the weight of exclusion, limitation, or redefinition. By beginning with the original language and following how it was used in case law, you equip yourself to see how modern debates about citizenship and rights are rooted in centuries-old distinctions. The words may appear simple, but their implications are profound. Footnote. This section demonstrates that the difference between people and persons is the cornerstone for understanding all subsequent debates on citizenship and rights. 3. The Dred Scott case and the constitutional divide. You must confront the reality that the Dred Scott v. Sandford decision of 1857 represents one of the sharpest legal clarifications of the distinction between people and persons. In this case, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, declared that individuals of African descent, whether free or enslaved, could not be considered part of the political community defined as the people of the United States. You must recognize that Taney did not invent this distinction. Rather, he applied the existing text of the Constitution, which already placed persons of African descent outside the scope of sovereignty. The Constitution's slave importation clause and the 3/5 clause had already carved this separation into the structure of law. Taney's ruling simply articulated the uncomfortable truth: citizenship, sovereignty, and the rights flowing from them were denied on the basis of race. For you, the case demonstrates how the legal system can be bound to words that perpetuate exclusion. It also shows how a judge may follow the letter of the Constitution while producing outcomes that conflict with modern moral standards. To understand Dred Scott is to understand that the Supreme Court, at that time, reinforced the view that African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. You must take from this ruling the lesson that legal definitions are not neutral. They are instruments that either include or exclude, empower or diminish. When the law separates people from persons, it sets in motion outcomes that shape the daily lives and rights of entire populations. Footnote. This section explains that Dred Scott v. Sanford confirmed the exclusion of African Americans from the people, embedding racial separation into constitutional interpretation. 4. The Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments. You must see the Civil War as the great rupture in the constitutional order, where the nation confronted the contradiction between liberty and slavery. The war was not only a contest over territory but also a contest over the definition of citizenship. The South sought to preserve an economy and society dependent upon enslaved persons, while the North refused to permit disunion to achieve that end. From this conflict emerged the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. You must understand their sequencing. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th defined citizenship and extended equal protection under law, the 15th guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. Each amendment represented an attempt to dismantle the legal framework that had sanctioned human bondage and exclusion. Yet, you must also recognize that these amendments did not erase the legacy of Dred Scott. The 13th Amendment freed individuals, but freedom without legal protection left them vulnerable to exploitation and violence. The 14th Amendment created a federal citizenship category, but its language, speaking of persons rather than people, raised new ambiguities. The 15th Amendment promised suffrage, but systemic barriers, intimidation, and legal maneuvering undermined its reach for generations. For you, the Reconstruction Amendments reveal both progress and compromise. They are revolutionary in expanding the constitutional promise to millions who had been denied it, but they also highlight how law, even when reformed, struggles to overcome entrenched power and prejudice. Footnote. This section outlines how the Reconstruction Amendments sought to resolve the exclusion affirmed in Dred Scott, while also leaving unresolved tensions between freedom, citizenship, and equality. 5. The Slaughterhouse Cases and the Birth of Federal Citizenship. You must recognize the Slaughterhouse Cases of 1873 as the decisive turning point in American constitutional law regarding citizenship. While the 14th Amendment had introduced a new category of citizen of the United States, it was not until this litigation that the Supreme Court clarified what that meant. In these cases, Justice Samuel Freeman Miller delivered the opinion that distinguished sharply between state citizenship and federal citizenship. He explained that one could be a citizen of the United States without being a citizen of any particular state. The purpose, he stated, was primarily to secure protections for the formerly enslaved who had been left vulnerable after emancipation. For you, this decision is crucial because it created two parallel frameworks. A state citizen retained rights rooted in the Bill of Rights and state constitutions, while a U.S. citizen acquired a separate set of protections under the 14th Amendment. The court limited the privileges and immunities of federal citizenship, effectively confirming that the amendment's central purpose was to protect the freedmen from state oppression, not to redefine the rights of all white citizens. You must also understand that this ruling marked the beginning of a constitutional duality. It institutionalized the federal government's authority to regulate civil rights, but it simultaneously left intact the state-based conception of citizenship for whites. Thus, the Slaughterhouse Cases represent both a safeguard for newly freed persons and a legal barrier preserving pre-existing hierarchies. Footnote. This section highlights the Slaughterhouse Cases as the first judicial clarification of the 14th Amendment, establishing the enduring divide between federal and state citizenship. 6. The expansion of the term person to legal fictions. You must understand that the 1886 case Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad marks a seismic shift in the legal meaning of person. Prior to this ruling, the term applied only to natural persons within the framework of the Constitution and statutory law. In this decision, however, the court extended equal protection under the 14th Amendment to corporations. For you, the consequence is profound. By granting corporations the legal status of persons, the court allowed artificial entities to claim constitutional rights once reserved for human beings. This change transformed the economic landscape by shielding corporate assets and operations with constitutional protections. In practice, it made the corporation a vehicle not only for commerce but also for political power. You should also note that this decision blurred the boundaries between individual and collective rights. It allowed corporations to resist taxation, regulation, and state restrictions under the same legal doctrines that protected individuals. The doctrine of corporate personhood, birthed here, has since enabled multinational corporations to exert influence equivalent to, and often greater than, sovereign individuals. The implication is that the 14th Amendment, originally constructed to safeguard freedmen, became the foundation for corporate dominance in American law. What was once a shield for vulnerable persons became a sword for powerful institutions. Footnote. This section emphasizes that Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad expanded personhood to corporations, embedding corporate rights within the 14th Amendment and reshaping American constitutional and economic order. 7. The Social Security number and the legal identity of the individual as a business entity. You must recognize that the creation of the Social Security number, SSN, redefined the concept of individual in statutory law. In the Internal Revenue Code and Treasury regulations, the term individual does not point to a natural man or woman in their private capacity. Instead, it designates a taxable entity classified either as a sole proprietorship or as an estate. When you apply for an SSN, you are not merely enrolling in a benefits program. You are effectively attaching a tax identification number to a legal fiction, a business structure recognized by the government. The Treasury regulations at 26 CFR 301.7701-1 clarify that an individual is treated the same as an unincorporated business. This explains why the SS4 application for an Employer Identification Number, EIN, lists sole proprietorship in the same column as individual. Both fall under the same definitional umbrella. For you, this means that when you present an SSN, you are not acting as a private state citizen. You are acting as the representative of a federally regulated business entity. This business entity, the individual, is subject to federal taxation, regulation, and licensing. It is through this construct that obligations such as income tax, payroll reporting, and Social Security contributions attach. In essence, the SSN transformed the natural person into a commercial actor by presumption. By stepping into this role, knowingly or unknowingly, you operate within the 14th Amendment framework as a federally recognized legal entity. This explains why federal forms and contracts demand certification under penalty of perjury that you are a U.S. person, defined explicitly as a citizen or resident alien tied to an SSN. Footnote. This section highlights that the Social Security number converts the individual into a business entity, a sole proprietorship or estate, thus binding natural persons into federal jurisdiction and commercial law under the 14th Amendment. 8. The sole proprietorship as a legal fiction and its separation from the living man or woman. You must understand that a sole proprietorship, in law, is not the same as you in your natural and private capacity. It is a legal fiction, a business construct, recognized under federal statutes and tax codes. The Internal Revenue Service treats this individual as a taxable person, but the law does not equate it with the living man or woman. As the living being, you are the owner and controller of this entity. You present and represent the sole proprietorship when engaging with government, banks, or commercial institutions. The sole proprietorship cannot exist or act independently. It requires you, as the living agent, to sign, certify, and bind it into contracts. This relationship mirrors that of a trustee to a trust, or a corporate officer to a corporation. For you, this means that whenever you sign federal tax forms, loan documents, or licenses using the all-capitalized name associated with the Social Security number, you are not acting as yourself in your private capacity. You are acting in the commercial role of the representative of the sole proprietorship. If this distinction is ignored, you risk personal liability where none should exist, since the obligations were never meant to attach to your private estate. Recognizing this separation empowers you to limit liability, prevent mischaracterization, and properly assert that you are not the sole proprietorship itself. You are merely the one who has authority to operate it, just as an executor has authority to administer an estate without being the estate. Footnote. This section explains that the sole proprietorship, created through federal definitions, is a legal fiction entirely separate from the living man or woman, who serves only as its owner and representative. 9. The Ninth Amendment is the true license of the state citizen. You must recognize that the Ninth Amendment serves as the ultimate source of authority for a state citizen to act without reliance on federal licensing or permission. It reads that the enumeration of certain rights in the Constitution shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. For you, this means that your rights do not depend upon the 14th Amendment or upon statutory privileges. They rest upon the original constitutional guarantee that what is not expressly surrendered remains with the people. The implications are far-reaching. A state citizen, domiciled within a state, does not require a driver's license, a professional license, or a business permit to exercise what the Constitution recognizes as natural and enumerated rights. These rights are not granted by the government but are acknowledged to exist independently of it. Any attempt by federal or state agencies to compel a state citizen to seek permission for ordinary acts of life effectively converts unalienable rights into state-controlled privileges, which is contrary to the Ninth Amendment's command. For you, the Ninth Amendment functions as the true license. It is broader and more powerful than any state-issued permit. It establishes that unless your actions cause injury, loss, or damage to another, you cannot lawfully be restricted. The state may regulate privileges for statutory persons, but it cannot regulate natural rights without destroying the very basis of constitutional liberty. Footnote. This section establishes that the Ninth Amendment is the supreme authority for state citizens, functioning as their true license and protecting rights from being diminished into privileges. 10. The 14th Amendment is a statutory Bill of Rights for federal persons. You must understand that the 14th Amendment was not drafted to expand the liberties of the original state citizens. Rather, its central purpose was to construct a new legal class, those persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction. This category was created after the Civil War to address the status of freed slaves and others who were excluded from the original compact of We the People. For you, the distinction is critical. The Bill of Rights binds government in relation to the sovereign people of the states, but the 14th Amendment provides a statutory framework of rights and privileges for federal persons. These protections resemble those in the Bill of Rights, but they are contractual in nature and limited by federal oversight. Thus, invoking the 14th Amendment is an admission that you stand not as one of the people under the Constitution, but as a federal person under congressional jurisdiction. The courts have reinforced this distinction in numerous rulings, describing the 14th Amendment as a mechanism to ensure that states cannot deny certain minimum protections to those who qualify as persons under its scope. Yet these protections are privileges, not inherent rights. For state citizens, reliance upon the 14th Amendment amounts to a forfeiture of constitutional standing. For federal persons, it represents their sole shield against abuse, but also their tether to federal control. Footnote. This section clarifies that the 14th Amendment functions as a statutory Bill of Rights for federal persons, distinct from the inherent protections held by state citizens under the original Constitution. 11. The incorporation doctrine and the expansion of federal jurisdiction. You must recognize that the incorporation doctrine became the judicial tool by which the Supreme Court extended selected provisions of the Bill of Rights into the 14th Amendment framework. Through this doctrine, rights originally binding only upon the federal government were incrementally applied against the states, but only through the status of federal persons. For you, this means the protections of free speech, due process, and equal protection were not expanded to the people of the states in their sovereign capacity. Instead, they were recast as privileges conferred upon 14th Amendment persons. This subtle but deliberate shift altered the balance of federalism. Where state constitutions and common law had once been the primary guardians of liberty, federal courts now asserted a supervisory role under the guise of incorporation. The result was a gradual erosion of state sovereignty and the expansion of federal jurisdiction over matters once exclusively local. The doctrine allowed federal courts to police state conduct in areas such as criminal procedure, voting rights, and education. But this extension came at a cost. Those seeking its protections were necessarily acknowledging their identity as federal persons, not as sovereign members of the original constitutional compact. Footnote: This section explains that the incorporation doctrine expanded federal jurisdiction by applying portions of the Bill of Rights to the states through the 14th Amendment, thereby redefining constitutional protections as privileges for federal persons. 12. The 9th and 10th Amendments as exclusive protections of state citizens. You must understand that while the incorporation doctrine extended selected rights of the Bill of Rights into the 14th Amendment framework, two provisions remain outside of that incorporation, the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment. This deliberate omission preserved them as the exclusive domain of state citizens. For you, the 9th Amendment serves as a reservoir of enumerated rights retained by the people. It provides the foundation for exercising liberties that require no statutory license, such as the right to travel, to contract, or to carry arms, so long as no harm is inflicted on others. The 10th Amendment, by contrast, affirms that powers not delegated to the federal government remain with the states or the people, thereby reinforcing the sovereignty of the original constitutional compact. These two amendments operate as constitutional guardrails. For state citizens, they secure the full scope of liberty without reliance on federal privileges. For federal persons, however, they hold no force, since incorporation never extended them into the 14th Amendment framework. Thus, the 9th and 10th stand as a constitutional divide. They affirm the sovereignty of the states and the independence of their citizens, while leaving federal persons bound within the privileges and limitations of congressional jurisdiction. Footnote: This section clarifies that the 9th and 10th Amendments remain unincorporated, functioning as exclusive protections for state citizens and preserving their sovereignty outside of federal jurisdiction. 13. Qualified immunity and its 14th Amendment origins. You must recognize that the doctrine of qualified immunity, which shields government officials from liability for constitutional violations, is rooted entirely in the 14th Amendment framework. The seminal case arose when African American ministers entered whites-only facilities during peaceful protests. Their claims against the police were adjudicated not under the Bill of Rights directly, but through the 14th Amendment. For you, this means that qualified immunity is not a universal principle applied across all citizens. It is a construct designed to regulate the relationship between U.S. citizens, those classified under the 14th Amendment, and state actors. It grants protection to officials who violate rights within that category, provided the rights were not clearly established at the time of the conduct. State citizens, however, exist outside this framework. Because the 9th and 10th Amendments remain their exclusive protections, state citizens are not bound by the statutory immunities conferred through the 14th Amendment. If a state citizen is injured or deprived of liberty by government officials, the shield of qualified immunity does not lawfully apply. In this way, the doctrine reinforces the bifurcated structure of American law. Federal protections and immunities govern persons under congressional jurisdiction, while state citizens retain direct access to the original constitutional safeguards. Footnote: This section explains that qualified immunity applies only to 14th Amendment U.S. citizens, leaving state citizens outside its scope and free to pursue redress unimpeded by that doctrine. 14. The incorporation doctrine and its limits. You should understand that the incorporation doctrine is the legal mechanism through which portions of the Bill of Rights were extended to apply to U.S. citizens under the 14th Amendment. Through selective incorporation, courts imported certain fundamental rights, such as freedom of speech, the right to counsel, and protections against unreasonable searches, into the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. For you, however, it is critical to note that not all rights were incorporated. The 9th and 10th Amendments, which reserve and enumerated rights to the people and powers to the states, remain unincorporated. This means that they are still tied exclusively to the original state citizen framework. If you operate as a state citizen, your rights are anchored in those amendments and cannot be abridged or limited by federal interpretations under the 14th Amendment. This limitation reveals the structural boundary of incorporation. It was designed to protect the newly created U.S. citizen class, particularly freedmen and non-whites, by granting them specific rights through federal enforcement. Yet the doctrine intentionally left certain elements, such as the 9th and 10th Amendments, outside of incorporation, thereby preserving the distinct autonomy of state citizenship. Footnote. This section highlights that incorporation selectively applied parts of the Bill of Rights to U.S. citizens, but left the 9th and 10th Amendments solely with state citizens. 15. The 9th Amendment is a state citizen's license. You must recognize that the 9th Amendment functions as the most powerful legal instrument available to a state citizen. Unlike U.S. citizens, who must rely on statutory licenses to drive, carry weapons, practice professions, or engage in regulated activities, state citizens are shielded by the 9th Amendment itself. This provision secures an enumerated rights retained by the people, and courts have repeatedly acknowledged that its purpose is to prevent governmental encroachment on liberties not expressly listed elsewhere. For you, this means that the 9th Amendment operates as a universal license. It covers activities that would otherwise require government permission under the statutory regime governing U.S. citizens. Driving, concealed carry, practicing law or medicine, fishing, and countless other actions fall within the protected sphere of an enumerated rights for state citizens. Attempting to substitute a 14th Amendment license for this inherent authority not only misclassifies you, but also risks criminal liability for false representation. Therefore, as a state citizen, you should treat the 9th Amendment not merely as abstract constitutional theory, but as the concrete legal basis for exercising rights in daily life. It is your license, one granted not by statute but by constitutional guarantee. Footnote. This section establishes that the 9th Amendment acts as a comprehensive license for state citizens, displacing statutory licensing requirements. 16. The 10th Amendment and reserved powers of the states. You must understand that the 10th Amendment is the constitutional anchor for state sovereignty. It provides that powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This language creates a critical boundary. Federal authority is limited to enumerated powers, while all other powers remain with the states and their citizens. For you as a state citizen, the 10th Amendment ensures that your political and legal identity rests primarily within your state of domicile. Unlike U.S. citizens, who are governed under the 14th Amendment framework and its extensive federal reach, state citizens claim protection under the 10th Amendment as a shield against federal overreach. This doctrine explains why state governments can establish their own constitutions, laws, and regulatory structures independent of Congress, provided they do not conflict with the federal charter. By invoking the 10th Amendment, you assert that your rights and obligations flow not from federal statutes, but from your state's constitution and the common law traditions underpinning it. It is not simply a symbolic provision, it is a live guarantee that decentralizes authority and preserves your position as a member of a sovereign state polity. Footnote. This section highlights the 10th Amendment as the constitutional safeguard of state sovereignty and its role in protecting the authority of state citizens against federal encroachment. 17. The 11th Amendment and State Immunity. You must recognize that the 11th Amendment fundamentally altered the balance between individuals and state governments in the federal judiciary. Its text provides that the judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state, or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. This provision erected a jurisdictional barrier protecting states from being haled into federal court without their consent. For you as a state citizen, this doctrine means that your state enjoys immunity from suits brought in federal courts by out-of-state citizens or foreign nationals. The principle of sovereign immunity, deeply rooted in English common law, was constitutionally entrenched in the 11th Amendment to prevent the federal judiciary from being used as a weapon against state treasuries and state sovereignty. You should also note that later interpretations expanded this principle. Even citizens of the same state cannot sue their own state in federal court without the state's explicit waiver. Thus, while the amendment text speaks narrowly, judicial construction has broadened state immunity as a structural protection of federalism. In practice, this confirms that states retain a sovereign character, immune from unwanted intrusion, consistent with their reserved powers under the 10th Amendment. Footnote. This section underscores the 11th Amendment as the constitutional embodiment of state sovereign immunity, shielding states from involuntary suits in federal court. 18. The Supremacy Clause and Federal Preemption. You must understand that the Supremacy Clause, located in Article Virgin Islands of the Constitution, establishes the Constitution, federal statutes, and treaties as the supreme law of the land. For you, this means that when state and federal law conflict, federal law prevails. This principle is not merely rhetorical, it has practical force in countless areas of governance, from commerce and banking to civil rights and environmental regulation. Courts have developed the doctrine of preemption to interpret the reach of the Supremacy Clause. Express preemption occurs when Congress explicitly states that federal law displaces state law. Implied preemption takes two forms: field preemption, where federal regulation is so comprehensive that it occupies the field, leaving no room for state action, and conflict preemption, where state law either makes compliance with federal law impossible or obstructs federal objectives. For you as a state citizen or practitioner, the Supremacy Clause acts as both a shield and a sword. It shields individuals from inconsistent or burdensome state regulations that undermine federal protections. At the same time, it empowers federal authority to display state action in areas where national uniformity is deemed essential. The doctrine of preemption therefore represents one of the most consequential tools in preserving federal primacy within our dual system of government. Footnote. This section highlights the Supremacy Clause as the foundation of federal preemption, ensuring national law overrides state enactments when conflicts arise. 19. The Commerce Clause and Federal Power Expansion. You must appreciate that the Commerce Clause, found in Article I, Section 8, grants Congress the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. At its core, this provision was designed to eliminate the economic fragmentation that plagued the Articles of Confederation by creating a national market free of trade barriers among the states. Over time, the Supreme Court has interpreted this clause as a primary engine for federal authority. In its early decisions, such as Gibbons v. Ogden, the court confirmed that interstate commerce included navigation and struck down conflicting state monopolies. Later, during the New Deal era, the court dramatically expanded the scope of the Commerce Clause in cases like Wickard v. Filburn, holding that even local, non-commercial activity could be regulated if it substantially affected interstate commerce. For you, The significance lies in recognizing how this provision transformed Congress from a limited lawmaking body into a regulator of nearly every aspect of economic life. Federal labor laws, civil rights protections, environmental statutes, and financial regulations all trace their constitutional legitimacy to expansive readings of the Commerce Clause. The doctrine illustrates how a single constitutional provision has been leveraged to justify the vast modern administrative state. Footnote. This section explains how the Commerce Clause evolved from regulating trade to legitimizing broad federal oversight of economic and social policy. 20. The Necessary and Proper Clause and Implied Powers. You must understand that the Necessary and Proper Clause, located in Article I, Section 8, grants Congress the authority to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution its enumerated powers. At first glance, the language might appear restrictive, suggesting only laws strictly required to implement specified powers. Yet, judicial interpretation has consistently favored a broad and flexible application. In McCulloch v. Maryland, Chief Justice Marshall articulated that necessary does not mean absolutely essential but rather encompasses all means conducive to the legitimate ends of government. This reasoning upheld Congress's power to charter a national bank, despite no explicit textual reference to banking in the Constitution. From this foundation, the doctrine of implied powers was born. For you, the importance lies in recognizing that this clause functions as the hinge between limited enumeration and expansive federal authority. It has justified the creation of agencies, regulatory schemes, and entire areas of governance not explicitly named in the Constitution. Without it, the federal government's capacity to adapt to unforeseen challenges, such as technological innovation, financial crises, or national defense exigencies, would be sharply limited. The Necessary and Proper Clause illustrates how constitutional text can be read dynamically to empower institutional growth while still tethered to enumerated powers. Footnote. This section emphasizes how the Necessary and Proper Clause expanded federal authority by enabling implied powers, with McCulloch v. Maryland as its cornerstone.